The world's earliest farming cultures evolved in North Syria, Turkey, Jordan, Thailand, and South Asia from around the 8th to 6th millennium BCE. Today's discussion is about the emergence of earliest farming cultures in South Asia. Explorations and excavations in Balochistan has revealed the earliest level of farming culture from this area. The site which has yielded wonderful evidence for this is Mehergarh. It is located in the Kachi plains in Balochistan on the banks of the Bolan River. This river actually flows through a plain which is an extension of the Indus Valley into the Balochistan region, jutting into the Iranian plateau. And the gorge through which the Bolan River passes is actually a connecting layer between the northern part of Balochistan and the valley area. This is the area where the silt deposits from the rivers and hill torrents had laid out a very deep, substantially deep alluvial layer, so that the region has become practically the breadbasket for Balochistan. And this very area is also the homeland for the earliest farming cultures in South Asia. Explorations were laid first by the pioneer French archaeologist Beatrice de Gardy, followed by the French team led by J.F. Jarrier and Catherine Jarrier, and they have recovered substantial amount of evidence for us to now really be certain about the beginnings of the Neolithic agricultural sequence of human occupation in this region. Mehergarh actually has yielded evidence for 7 continuous layers of occupation, the first 3 of which are matters for discussion in this particular lecture. The first layer belongs to period 1, and that is datable to around 8th to 6th millennium BCE. This period is actually the first layer of period 1 is actually aceramic Neolithic, because there is no evidence for the use of ceramics here. The period 1b has yielded evidence for ceramic. Both the periods are actually related to the Neolithic culture, and we have the first signs of domestication of plants like wheat and barley, and animal species of sheep, goat, and increasingly cattle. The reason why we have the development of this farming culture here is its geographical location. Kachi is a flat alluvial plain, an extension of the Indus Valley into an anomalous nick in the eastern edge of Iranian plateau. Probably the Pleistocene Indus River flowed through this region, thus we now have a substantially deep alluvial layer. It is called the breadbasket of Balochistan, as I have already mentioned. The Bolan River flows down a major route of communication between the Indus Valley and Balochistan, the principal hydrological feature of the plain, and today runs along the eastern edge of the site. The earliest layer where we find the aceramic and Neolithic contexts is extended through 2 square kilometers at the edge of the Bolan Plateau site. However, it does not flow into the Indus but disappears into the alluvium of the plain. There are other more seasonal rain torrents coming down the hilly sloughs of the Balochistan uplands. This geographical setting has facilitated the growing of wheat and barley, the main cereal crops for the people of the Neolithic civilization. Period 1 has yielded evidence for charred grains of naked 6-row barley and hulled 2-row barley, as also wheat of 2 varieties, einkorn and emmer. There is also wonderful evidence for animal domestication from Mehergar. The Italian zoologist R.L. Constantini has found evidence for sequential domestication of 3 species, sheep, goat and cattle. Thousands of plant specimens were collected in the course of Mehergarh excavations. These included charred grains and seeds as well as impressions of grain on mud brick. Barley seems to have been the most important crop. In period 2, in addition to barley and wheat, there were numerous seeds of cotton, Gossypium species, found in a hearth. The Neolithic strata at Mehergarh has also yielded wonderful evidence for human dwellings. Sun-dried mud bricks laid one over the other actually were laid out into compartmented buildings, single rows of compartmental buildings which might have also served the purposes of storage units. The dwelling units were usually 4 to 5 meters square, frequently divided into small rooms of up to 4 or even 6 in number. Floors often reveal impressions of reeds. Fireplaces often found in corners of rooms signify their use as ovens, as we have traces of smoke on plastered walls. Brick sizes were almost regular. Compartmented, longish buildings might have functioned as storage facilities. 11 seasons of excavations at Mehergarh has yielded evidence for a longish stretch of the site. The areas which have been segregated stand as MR1, MR2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. The evidence for the Neolithic has been found generally in MR3, MR4 and MR5 spots. Earliest evidence for farming culture therefore comes from MR3 and MR4. The sequence of occupation at Mehergarh is as follows. Period 1 and period 2 comprising the Neolithic actually were located in MR3 and MR4. Period 1, having the earliest layer of human occupation, is dated by calibrated radiocarbon dating to 7th to 6th millennium BCE. Period 2 ranges from 5500 BCE to 4500 BCE. Period 3 is 4500 BCE. This is the very time from when we begin to witness the efflorescence of first farming village cultures throughout Balochistan. Period 1 at Mehergarh has yielded thousands of microliths as well as hand axes or celts. Stone items like grinders and mullers, stone querns were also part of the food debitage at Mehergarh, period 1. Period 2 sequence reveals increased use of material things. We have compartmented houses increasing in number. For example, we've recovered the evidence for 23 compartmented buildings at the period 2 levels. Other assemblages include flint, blades, cores, beads, terracotta items like terracotta mother goddess pieces. Animal domestication is also evident at Mehergarh. From period 1, we find that among the assemblages there is variety of animals to be found, wild and domesticable species. Among the domesticable species we find more of sheep, goat and cattle, with cattle increasing with time. The detection of size diminution of long bones in domesticable species signify that they were getting tamed with time. Such evidence also indicate that from period 1 to period 2 there was more preference for cattle than sheep and goat. Lorenzo Constantini's discoveries show that the people at Mehergarh were gradually transcending from hunting-gathering to sedentary agricultural economy. The people of period 1 buried their dead in the open spaces between their houses. The bodies were placed in oval pits in a flexed position. The bones were often covered with red ochre, suggesting some kind of fertility cult. In at least 2 burials, young goats had been placed near the feet of the body. Grave goods included bitumen-lined baskets and food offerings, ornaments such as necklaces made of stone and shell beads, bone pendants, and anklets. A copper bead was found in one of the burials. Pottery is introduced in period 2. It is a soft, chaff-tempered ware, handmade with simple shapes. Wheel-made pottery made their appearance in period 2C. The faunal assemblage at Mehergarh indicates that there was a gradual transition from hunting-gathering to domestication of animals. We have among the period 1 assemblage bones of wild animals like black buck, cheetal, onager or wild ass, water buffalo, and elephant. But we see as time progressed, there was a shift towards domestication of animals like sheep, goat, and cattle. But surprisingly enough, in period 3, we find that there is more of sheep and goat bones rather than cattle, which shows that there was a transformation from agriculture to kind of shepherding. And then again, there was also an increase in wild animal species. Does this indicate that there was a resurgence in hunting activity? Or did this mean that there was an equal balance between hunting, gathering, and agricultural activities? There is a very interesting evidence in the form of a copper bead. As it is, the finding of this copper bead at such an early level is very interesting. But more than that, it has been analyzed that some traces of cotton thread was adhering to this copper bead. And this report has been made by Christophe Moulehard in the Journal of Archaeological Science, which was published in 2002. This is perhaps the evidence for the first use of cotton thread in the world. Another very interesting evidence also comes from period 1 at Mehergarh, and that is the evidence for the world's first dentistry. In the graves, skeletons of 9 adults were found to have their molar crown drilled with some kind of a very fine stone blade, probably attached to a wooden handle. It seems that they might have used some kind of a botanical ingredient to put into the cavities that were formed in the teeth of these adults. This has been reported by A. Koppa and others in the science journal Nature in the year 2008. This is probably the first instance of dentistry in the world's history. Subsequent reports from the medical professionals in the journals of dentistry have provided interesting perspectives on this finding of prehistoric times. Period 2 at Mehergarh reveals greater number of artifacts and probably a more complicated craft activity. Most interestingly, we find that there is a lot of activity for stone blade industry. There is one very interesting example found in the form of a tool, a composite tool, which might have been used as a saw or might have been used as a sickle. This is actually a piece of bitumen which has been inserted with 3 series of blades, small bladelets, diagonally on each parallel side. The whole composite tool acts as a saw, or it might have acted as a sickle for cutting crops. This is a very wonderful innovation tried out by the Mehergarh farmers. From period 2 onwards, there is distinct evidence for craft specialization. For example, in some area we find extensive signature for pottery making. For example, we have furnaces here as well as heaps of broken shards of pottery. Now this actually reveals the coming pattern of craft specialization in more and more complex village lives. People were gradually progressing in their farming activities and they were providing scope for other secondary activities to the people who did not have to produce their own food. Excavations have yielded evidence for material culture of the people at this strata at Mehergarh. For example, we have come to know about the stone tool types, about the pottery, about the belief system probably, because we have terracotta figurines from this site. We also have evidence for connections with other cultures in the neighborhood. All these have led to the development of a lot of ideas and debates regarding the diffusion of culture from other sides, as also the indigenous local growth of the Mehergarh culture from within. I have with me my colleagues from the Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture of Calcutta University today to discuss certain points. Here is Dr. Rita Chaudhary, the head of the department now, and this is my younger colleague Preeta Bhattacharya from the same department.
Mehergarh was one of the earliest cradles of animal domestication. Can we really ascertain that?
You see, it is not only the cradle of animal domestication, it is probably also an independent cradle for plant domestication. Now, the whole problem relates to the matter of the natural habitat of the wild species which have been found domesticated in this area. See, it starts with wondering about whether such common animal species like cattle, sheep on the one hand, and plant species like barley and wheat on the other hand were naturally available in the wild in the region, you know. Now, as to that, we do not have much indication. You see, one of the earliest evidence comes from this area about both the plant and animal domestications. Archaeologists have found sites from Syria, Lebanon, Israel, southwestern Turkey, and Iraq and western Iran also. But even then, we do not have the wild taxa still existing. It is because they are the most common edible and domesticated species. So the wild species is no longer to be found in the entire region. So what is the best clue then? The best clue is archaeologically available. And for this, since a lot of evidence in the wild form as well as in the domesticated form have been found from the sites, the Neolithic sites in this entire region, which is generally termed as the Middle Asia complex. Therefore, archaeologists have a general feeling that this is the cradle of civilization.
Yes.
As you know, that Gordon Childe had called it the cradle of civilization, the fertile crescent in the Near East. So this is the region which is generally held to be the heart of domestication of both plants and animals. But of recent times, what happened is that from 1960s and 70s onwards, certain evidence has started coming from Afghanistan and finally from Mehergarh, which puts us to some other notions, you know. It leads us to question whether there was a single heart of domestication or whether there were multiple independent centers of domestication. See, from Afghanistan, L. Dupree had carried out excavations at the Akkupruk caves in southern Afghanistan, and there at about the date which goes about 8000 BCE, there is enough evidence to show that there was both wild cattle as well as domesticated cattle. This is also true for sheep and goat. Now, this probably indicates that one of the earliest areas for independent domestication of these three animal species might have been Afghanistan. Okay. On the other hand, we have at Mehergarh the entire evidence for both plant and animal domestication. And therefore, in this book you will find this discussion. Gregory L. Pozell has posited, he suggests that whether we should not think in terms of multiple centers of domestication. So this is new area, these are the debates, but of course we need to carry out much more paleozoological and paleobotanical researches in other sites to understand fully the complex ideas, you know. Rita, can we have a little bit more about the material culture that we find at Mehergarh, which might help us to understand more about this site?
Well, archaeologists have unearthed evidence of a long sequence of existence at this site, starting from period 1, about 7000 BC, to period 8. And within this, the first, at the very primary stage, we find huts of nomadic pastoral people. This is followed at a later stage by dwelling houses made of handmade sun-baked bricks, and some of them have already been identified as granaries, though they were small in size. So we have evidence that people had already begun to depend on a past agrarian economy. Now, granaries became bigger at a later stage, and so there is definite evidence that they had begun to depend on this agrarian economy. What is interesting in this period, as we find the evidence of a copper bead from a grave site. But then the question arises whether they were regular users of copper at this stage. We must remember that regular use of copper began in about BC 4000. So it must be a stray evidence of that they knew about copper. But more interesting than this is the find of a turquoise bead. This is not a local resource material, so they must have been imported from outside, and most probably this was from Turkomania. So there is evidence of long distance trade from this period alone. So this is very interesting because we have evidence then that from 6000 BC long distance trade was known to the people at Mehergarh. When we pass on to period 2, the most interesting thing about this stage is that they became acquainted with pottery manufacture. Initially, lumps of clay was put on one on top of the other, and they were shaped into crude utensils, which were handmade utensils for their daily use. Next, the next stage was they used to line baskets with absol and bitumen, like a sort of cement, to be used as molds for the potteries. Then, about 4000 BC came the potter's wheel. It must have come from West Asia. Scholars think it must have come from West Asia, since this potter's wheel had been introduced there at about 5000 BC. So we have a regular manufacture of potteries, and gradually they became more complex at a later stage when designs came to be inscribed on them, natural designs, plants, animals, then geometric designs, and then gradually it became more complex pottery manufacture. Now, speaking about other things, we find the use of shell and lapis lazuli. So again we have evidence of long distance trade, because these are not local materials. Shell could have come from the Makran coast, and lapis lazuli from the only place that we know of is Badakhshan. So again we have evidence of long distance trade. Now, initially also we find crude figurines. Just one evidence from period 1, and gradually at a later stage in period 3 we find more figurines which have been terracotta mother goddess, which have been identified as mother goddess. We have a sickle blade has been found.
I have discussed this already. So
which has been
very interesting,
hafted on a handle with bitumen. So this was perhaps one of the earliest evidence of a tool used for harvesting in this subcontinent. So they had, naturally we have evidence, definite evidence, that agriculture has assumed a primary position of predominance in their life. They had begun to depend largely on agriculture for their living, though we must remember the other sides of their subsistence, like hunting and food gathering, has not completely gone out of existence. They also existed. From all these evidences, it is clear that even before the Harappan civilization, there is a trend towards moving towards urbanization in this area much before the Harappan civilization came into existence.
What about the diffusion of this culture? You had talked about this earlier.
Yeah.
So please could you elaborate?
From 5000 BCE, probably in the nearby region of Quetta, Zob Valley, Lorelei Valley to lying farther north of Mehergar, there was this emergence of farming cultures, farming village units, and one of the earliest and most important sites is Kiligul Muhammad, where we have the earliest layer going even beyond 5000 BCE, and the period 1 actually was a settlement of the nomadic pastoralists. We do not have much evidence for dwelling units, but from later period we start getting these wattle and daub houses. See, along with that we also have evidence for animals, and at other sites we start getting evidence for paleobotany also. So it seems that there was an entire complex of agrarian villages growing up in the region, in the neighborhood. And the other thing, very interesting fact, is that even from Central Asia, we have got certain evidence for the use of a ceramic which is very typical to the Quetta ware. It's very similar to the Quetta ware, very typical of this particular region of the pre-Harappan Chalcolithic. So there is a possibility that there was an entire corridor. Now this Middle Asia complex, according to, as I said, according to G.L. Posel, he thinks that the phenomena of the rise of agrarian culture in this particular region in northwest of South Asia actually is linked to whatever was happening in the Fertile Crescent region. And he says that the Fertile Crescent region is the nuclear zone from where the culture had diffused. But again, there might be a diffusion of the entire cultural pattern, but individually speaking, these cultures were trying out their own innovations. They were coming up and they were growing from within. So this is the thing that I had been trying to discuss. Okay, the indigenous growth from within. So what can we conclude from this?
I think from what that we have all talked about, we notice that there is a transition from a semi-nomadic pastoral stage to food production, and life goes from a simple stage to a more complex stage. In the initial stage, we find changes like increasing sedentarism, craft production, use of tools in a variety of ways, building of houses, dwellings, and then the identification as granaries is important in the sense that there is the concrete evidence that we are changing from a pastoral economy to agrarian economy. Then gradually life becomes more complex when we see in the next period that there is increasing craft specialization, complex administrative and social structure, and then from this leads into a more developed society and economy. So when it is very interesting to trace the various stages that through which we have passed from a very early primary stage to a more complex society.
So from all that we have discussed here, we can say confidently that the foundation stone for what was to happen in the urban Chalcolithic culture was already laid in Mehergarh and around Mehergarh. So yeah, this is the beginning of the village farming culture, which will finally support the rise of the urban culture. Of Iranian plateau. Probably the Pleistocene Indus River flowed through this region. Thus we now have a substantially deep alluvial layer. It is called the breadbasket of Balochistan, as I have already mentioned. The Bolan River flows down a major route of communication between the Indus Valley and Balochistan. the principal hydrological feature of the plain, and today runs along the eastern edge of the site. The earliest layer where we find the Aceramic and Neolithic contexts is extended through 2 square kilometers at the edge of the Bolan Plateau site. However, it does not flow into the Indus but disappears into the alluvium of the plain. There are other more seasonal rain torrents coming down the hilly sloughs of the Balochistan uplands. This geographical setting has facilitated the growing of wheat and barley, the main cereal crops for the people of the Neolithic civilization. Period 1 has yielded evidence for charred grains of naked 6-row barley and cultural sequence of human occupation in this region. Mehergarh actually has yielded evidence for 7 continuous layers of occupation, the first 3 of which are matters for discussion in this particular lecture. The first layer belongs to period 1, and that is datable to around 8th to 6th millennium BCE. This period is actually the first layer of period 1 is actually Aceramic Neolithic, because there is no evidence for the use of ceramics here. The period 1b has yielded evidence for ceramic. Both the periods are actually related to the Neolithic culture, and we have the first signs of domestication of plants like wheat and barley and animal species of sheep, goat, and increasingly cattle. The reason why we have the development of this farming culture here is its geographical location. Kachi is a flat alluvial plain, an extension of the Indus Valley into an anomalous nick in the eastern edge. The world's earliest farming cultures evolved in North Syria, Turkey, Jordan, Thailand, and South Asia from around the 8th to 6th millennium BCE. Today's discussion is about the emergence of earliest farming cultures in South Asia. Explorations and excavations in Balochistan has revealed the earliest level of farming culture from this area. The site which has yielded wonderful evidence for this is Mehergarh. It is located in the Kachi plains in Balochistan on the banks of the Bolan river. This river actually flows through a plain which is an extension of the Indus Valley into the Balochistan region, jutting into the Iranian plateau. And the gorge through which the Bolan river passes is actually a connecting layer between the northern part of Balochistan and the valley area. This is the area where the silt deposits from the rivers and hill torrents had laid out a very deep, substantially deep alluvial layer, so that the region has become practically the breadbasket for Balochistan. And this very area is also the homeland for the earliest farming cultures in South Asia. Explorations were laid first by the pioneer French archaeologist Béatrice de Gardy, followed by the French team led by J.F. Jarrier and Catherine Jarrier, and they have recovered substantial amount of evidence for us to now really be certain about the beginnings of the Neolithic agriculture, hulled 2-row barley, as also wheat of 2 varieties, einkorn and emmer. There is also wonderful evidence for animal domestication from Mehergar. The Italian zoologist R.L. Constantini has found evidence for sequential domestication of 3 species, sheep, goat, and cattle. Thousands of plant specimens were collected in the course of Mehergar excavations. These included charred grains and seeds, as well as impressions of grain on mud brick. Barley seems to have been the most important crop. In period 2, in addition to barley and wheat, there were numerous seeds of cotton, Gossypium species, found in a hearth. The Neolithic strata at Mehergarh has also yielded wonderful evidence for human dwellings. Sun-dried mud bricks laid one over the other actually were laid out into compartmented buildings, single rows of compartmental buildings which might have also served the purposes of storage units. The